There is no school next week. The whole week.
Okay. Oh, it works. Well, good morning, everybody. God bless you. I am so happy to be here with you in Toronto, Canada, and it is my privilege to get to meet all of you. I've had such a great time in the day and a half that I've been in the country, meeting a lot of people and getting to know a lot of some of the students here and a lot of people around the community. It's exciting to be here. I think that all of you probably have the outline for the course, Israel, the Key to Human Destiny. Yes? And I have a book that is available that has the whole course in there. My job is not to sell books. My job is to teach students. But I do believe that you learn better when you have something that is chapter and verse and full paragraphs rather than just outlines. And so if you'd like to have the book, we make those available to you as well. It's not required. Whatever is going to be on the test comes directly from the syllabus, not from the book. So you don't have an advantage for the test grade that way. But I do think that it'll probably be more meaningful to you if you're able to read it in chapter and verse form. All right, let's begin with prayer. Father, we just thank you so much for the wonderful opportunity that we have to fellowship around the Word of God. And Lord, we just believe you that when we share these lessons over the next few hours, Father, that there is truth, there's revelation that's going to come. Lord, I am so thankful for the one couple that I've already had an opportunity to talk to this morning who said that their whole perspective on Israel was changed when they had this course in the past, that they had been part of a philosophy or theology that totally discredited what you were doing and intend to do through the people of Israel, and that this course brought revelation to them. And we believe you, Father, that even though that we may not have been part of such theologies that discredit the work that you're doing, Father, that even if we still already have a love for Israel, that this will be something that will intensify it and make it even more real in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty. Well, in your syllabus, I have no understanding as to why that it opens up and says Part 1, because the whole lesson really is one big lesson, and I think it had to do with dividing up some videotapes or something when they were recording it for extension use, and they divided into Part 1 and Part 2. But we're going to cover the whole story of Israel, if we can, during the time that we're together over these next few hours. Israel is unique. There is something different about Israel that no other nation on earth can claim. I'd like to begin by reading to you an analysis of the land of Israel, the people of the Jews, that was written by a man named Samuel Clemens. Any of you know Samuel Clemens? Mark Twain, yes. And Mark Twain is certainly not known as a theologian. And Mark Twain is not the kind of person that you would expect that would be meddling in this kind of study. But in 1897, he wrote in Harper's Magazine an article which was called Concerning the Jews. And here's what he says. If the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous, dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought to hardly be heard of, but he is heard of and has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and obtuse learning are also a way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in the world and in all the ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and faded to dream stuff, and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal, but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? The Jews stand out, and the Jewish people in the Jewish nation stand out as unique in all of human history and all of human society. They hold a very special place. One out of every 5 Nobel Peace Prizes that has ever been awarded was given to a Jewish person. And again, Mark Twain, at his statistics, said that they represent 1% of the human race. The last statistic I saw, it was more like 2% of the human race. But at any rate, they are insignificant in their number, but in their accomplishments, it is incredible. In the United States, they constitute about 2% of the population, but I think they constitute about 10% of our congressmen and senators. They stand in a unique position. Another thing is that there is no other people group in the world that has the honor of being labeled with a special word to describe a hatred for them. Anti-Semitism. There is a special word in our vocabulary to show that people have a resentment toward the Jewish people. In the United States, the difficulties that we have between the races, the segregation and the discrimination and the difficulties that occur between the different races. In some statistics that have been kept, the discrimination acts of discrimination and hostilities against the Jewish people constitute double the number of acts of offense as opposed to the ones against the black race. And the black race being 20-something% of our population, you would think, and we always hear so much about the racial issues between the whites and the blacks in America, but the truth is that in the United States, we actually have statistics that prove that we have shown more hostility against the Jewish race than against the Afro-American population. So it's interesting that these people, in some unique way, draw favor, but also draw discrimination. So let's go back and let's see exactly who these people are. The people of Israel are, of course, the descendants of Abraham. And Abraham was God's chosen, he chose through Abraham to establish a chosen race. And in point number A on page 2, I say that Abraham left idolatry to serve the one true God. It's kind of amazing to most people to think that Abraham actually came from an idolatry background. However, if you want to check your Bible, in Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, it tells us that Abraham's people were ones who served other gods. And we don't know any more history behind that than that one reference that says that he came from a people who served other gods. However, in the Muslim tradition, and of course, you know, Abraham was the father of the Muslim race, Muslim population as well, in that there was, he was the father not only of Isaac, but also, his brother Ishmael, and that's where that we get the Arab peoples from. But at any rate, when we look back into their records and into their legends and into their stories that they tell about Abraham, they say that Abraham actually came from a family not only of idol worshipers, but a family of idol makers. That Abraham's father was actually a merchant of idols. And of course, there's no historical background to this. This is just legend. But, to go with the legend to give us a familiarity of what could have been the situation, it's interesting to me that there are several stories that are told about that. One is that one day Terah, Abraham's father, had to go off on business. And so he left Abraham in charge of the shop. When he came back, he discovered that all the idols had been broken, except for one. And when he came back, he saw that one statue, that there had been a stick placed in his hand. And he looked at Abraham and he said, "Abraham, what have you done to all of my work? This is my work. This is our business. This is our family income. What have you done?" And he said, "Dad, I didn't do anything. There was a lady who came in and offered a sacrifice to this one idol, and all the others got jealous because that she brought an offering to it, and she didn't bring an offering to the rest of them, and so they all started to rebel against this one that had the offering, and they didn't have any, and so he took this stick and he broke them all in self-defense." And so the dad looks back at Abraham and he says, what kind of fool do you think I am? I made these statues with my own hands. And then Abraham looks at him and he says, let your own words condemn you. Well, now, there's no historical background behind that. It's just a legend. It's just a story that's been told. But at least it gives us a perspective of what kind of man it must have taken to rise up and say, I am going to worship only one God. There's only one true and living God. And so Abraham was that man who stood up against idolatry. And Abraham called God by the name of El Shaddai. Now, the Hebrew word El Shaddai is an interesting term because there are a couple of different ways to interpret exactly what it means. One interpretation means the multi-breasted one. And if you can think of that when you have a sow pig that gives birth, she has many breasts, and so she can have a large litter of little piglets. Okay, human females only have 2 breasts, and so we normally don't go beyond twins. You know, if you get triplets or quadruplets or whatever, it's considered to be fairly rare. So the concept of God having multiple breasts is showing that God can have multiple supply. He can supply abundantly, more than we would think or ask. So that's one concept of who El Shaddai, or how El Shaddai can be translated. The other way that El Shaddai can be translated is that he is the God of the mountains. And that Hebrew word seems very significant to me because if we do translate El Shaddai as the God of the mountains, then that means that anybody who worshiped an idol who was carved out of a piece of stone is limiting God. Because you're taking one piece of stone, and out of that piece of stone you're carving part of it away and leaving only even a portion of the stone that you started out with. And so he says, you worship this little bitty God that you carved out of one individual stone. I worship El Shaddai. I worship the God that is the God of the whole mountain, out of which that even one stone is just one little decibel, almost insignificant part of a mountain. And so I worship the God of the mountain. Now, mountains are significant because mountains make a difference. If you look at a map of the world and you start determining where different nations end and begin and where the boundaries are between the nations, you'll find that most nation boundaries are determined by mountain ranges. If it's not a mountain range, it's usually a river. There are very few places on earth where that the boundary lines between nations are drawn with just taking a ruler and a pen and saying, okay, it's going to be a straight line between here and there. Most of the boundaries follow through the tops of mountains or through rivers because those are natural boundaries. A natural boundary keeps an army from crossing over. I think we have all seen the pictures depicting Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants, to attack on the other side. But generally, when you see a mountain range, you say that is a natural boundary, an impenetrable mark that determines where a force can go. And so when Abraham looks and he says, I'm going to call God the God of the mountains, he's saying, man, this is my natural defense. There is a protection that I have in this God. He is significant enough that he can stop any kind of battle against me. And not only that, but there are places in the world where mountain ranges actually determine climate. there is, for instance, in South America, the Andes Mountains that run along on the western coast of South America. And when the weather, the winds and the clouds come in off of the Pacific Ocean and they hit the mountain range, those mountain ranges cause the moisture that's in the atmosphere to condense into rain and to flow down on the western slopes of those mountains. On the western slopes of the mountains, there are rainforests. On the eastern slopes of the same mountains, they are desert areas because all the moisture has come out of the clouds as they hit the slope coming, and so all the rain falls on the western side of the Andes Mountains. On the eastern side, it's desert. In fact, I have heard of one particular tribe of people that don't even have roofs on their houses. They have houses which are basically enclosures to keep people and animals from getting in, but they don't have to put roofs on them because that they never have any rain. And so, it's an amazing thing how much difference a mountain makes. Now, if you were Abraham and you got on your camel and you were going somewhere, you could pick up your statue, your idol that your father made, if indeed his father did make idols, but you could pick up that statue, stick it in your backpack, and get on your camel, and you could take your God with you where you wanted to go. However, if you came to a mountain range, that mountain range could stop you. And so you'd have to reroute because there's a mountain range in front of you. Do you see the difference between just having a statue that's made out of a rock and having a God that you recognize? Man, you are the God of the mountains. And so Abraham had this revelation of God, and that changed his life, and God spoke to him and through him that he was going to establish a relationship, a covenant relationship with God, with Abraham, because of his awareness of him. Okay, so in Genesis chapter 12 and 13 is where God first speaks to Abraham and tells him that he is going to have a special nation or a special relationship. And in chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3, God says, "And now the Lord has said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into a land that I will show thee. And I will make thee a great nation and bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse you, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." And then God continues his statement to Abraham in the 13th chapter when he visits in another time. "And the Lord said unto Abram, that Lot had separated from him, after Lot had separated from him, Lift up thine eyes and look from this place where thou art northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land which thou seest to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, and I will give it unto thee." And so God, in those two revelations to Abraham, told him 7 things. The first thing is, I'm going to show you a land. The second is, I'm going to make you a great nation. The third is, I'm going to make your name great. The fourth is, I'm going to bless you. And the fifth one is, I will curse those who curse you. The sixth one is, I will give this land, the north, the south, the east, and the west, to you and to your offspring forever. And the seventh one is, I will make your offspring as uncountable as the dust of the earth. Notice that there's, out of those 7 things, there's some very specific points we want to recognize. One is that he called Abraham and says, I'm going to bless you, but I'm not just going to bless you just to bless you. I'm going to bless you because through you and your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. God was not just picking Abraham out and saying, you're my favorite and I'm just going to do good stuff for you just because I want to do good stuff for you. He says, I'm going to do good stuff in your life so that you can be a blessing to the entire world. All the families of the earth are going to be blessed through you. And then he says, but that blessing is dependent upon how the people respond to you. If the people bless you, they are going to be blessed. If the people curse you, then they are going to be cursed. So he says, I'm blessing you so that you can bless the world, but it depends upon their relationship and their response to you. We're going to see, as we go through this course, how that the nations of the earth have determined their own destinies because of the relationship that they've had with the Jewish people. That's the reason that I call this book subtitled The Key to Human Destiny. The relationship that we have to the Jewish people, the relationship that we have to the nation of Israel, determines the destiny. It's the key to the destiny of all the other people in the world. And then God says, here's the land. It is not that the people of Israel themselves just maintain the blessing, but he says there's a special relationship to the fact that you live in the land of Israel. You live in this geographical piece of real estate, and that causes the blessing to come. You are a blessed people. This is a blessed land. The two of you in combination is very significant in God's eyes. Okay, so in chapter 15, when God then continues to speak about the blessing and the calling that he has given to the people of Israel and to Abraham and his family, God says, I want you to have a physical sign in which that you are going to show that you've accepted this blessing, and that this blessing is going to work in your life, that you're part of this covenant. And God says, I want you to take certain animals, and I want you to sacrifice them, and I want you to lay their carcasses on the ground, divided down the middle. So you just go right down the backbone, and you split the animals and lay them out. And in the process of doing that, that leaves kind of a bloody trail in between the two parts. And he says, and I'm going to have you to sit here all evening and ward off all of the vultures and all of the animals of prey, the birds of prey, that would come to eat the carcasses. Now, all of us have been down the highway and seen the birds of prey as they swoop down to try to eat the animals that have been hit on the highway. If a dog gets run over, or a cat or a deer or whatever, before that they can get moved off the highway, you see the birds coming to try to eat the flesh, right? And so God knew that there would be these vultures that would come that would try to eat the animals as they were laid out for sacrifice. And so he says, Abraham, your job for the rest of the evening is to shoo off all the birds that try to come. To me, that seems symbolic of the fact that there are going to be attempts to interrupt the blessing that God has put upon the Jewish people, the Israel and the nation of Israel. And we have seen that all through history. All through history, we've seen that there have been one attempt after another, and we'll talk about those, to try to destroy the blessing that God has established upon the Jewish people. Okay, so he says you're going to have to defend it, and you're going to have to protect the land. Today we see the same sort of thing happening with the Palestinians trying to claim that it's their land, and no nation in the world can figure out how to solve the issues, and they try to redraw the boundaries and try to have peace talks and one thing after another, and nothing ever works out. But you see, the Jews have continued to resist and stay on their land and stay in the place that God has given them. But God says, I'm going to have you to do that requirement. Then, during the evening hours, then God appeared, and it says in the form of a smoking pot, and he was not a resident of Colorado, in smoking pot. Okay, but God appeared in the form of a smoking pot and moved through the middle of the animals. Now, here's the interesting thing. In the ancient culture, when a covenant was made, they would make the covenant exactly this way by taking an animal, cutting it in half, and then both parties would have to walk through the path between the two parts of the carcass, stepping in the bloody spot where the carcass had been cut apart. Both parties that were making the covenant had to walk through that bloody trail. For Abraham, God says, you don't have to walk through. I am going to be the one who walks through. The point being, God established the covenant. God says, this is totally on my initiative. This is totally on my prerogative. I am totally responsible for this covenant. I'm not making it a bilateral. I'm making it a unilateral covenant. I am going to be responsible for seeing that this covenant is fulfilled. And so he sends Moses out to make that, sends Abraham out to make that covenant. And then in chapter 15, that's where he sets that covenant apart. But then in chapter 17, then he says, I want to ask for your side of the covenant. And in chapter 17, starting in verse 2, he says, and I will make my covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abraham fell on his face, and the Lord talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee, and I will make thee exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee, and I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto them, and I unto thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee and to the seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, and the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. And I will be their God. And God said unto Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant therefore thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. And this is my covenant thou shalt keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among thee shall be circumcised. And so then God says, I want to ask you to take one statement or one determination that you have become part of the covenant, and that is that you would be circumcised. God initiated the covenant, chapter 15. God himself walked through the bloody path between the two elements of the carcass, and God says, the covenant is all on me. But he says, but I want you to also do a covenant ritual in which that you say, I'm accepting that covenant. And by accepting that covenant, you go through circumcision as a physical sign that you have accepted that covenant. But the interesting thing is that he says that the covenant is between me and you, and between me and your seed. Now, Paul in the New Testament points out to us that the statement is in the singular, that the statement is individual seed, not seeds. There's an element that comes into play here that's quite interesting, and that is that even though it's a multi-generational covenant, there is one particular seed in every generation that is the direct heir to that covenant. Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. He actually had more sons than that. We'll talk about them a little bit later, but he says, you have two sons that we're going to name, we're going to talk about, we're going to tell their stories in the Bible, but only one of them can actually have the covenant. See, it went to Isaac and not to Ishmael. Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. Okay? Even though they were his seed, plural, there was only one seed that could actually have the covenant, and it goes to Jacob, not to Esau. Jacob had 12 sons, and apparently there was only one that was going to receive that. Remember Joseph, he seemed to be the heir apparent. He seemed to be the father's favorite. He was the one who got the multicolored coat, and nobody else did. There was always one seed that was the recipient of the covenant, even though the covenant blessings were multi-generational. They went to every generation, everybody that was an heir to Abraham. But he says, by taking this circumcision, you show that you have accepted that covenant. And then at this same time, God begins to talk to him about the land, and he says, there's going to be some specific boundaries to the covenant land that you're supposed to own. He tells us, and all the different passages are listed in your outline there, but he tells us that the western border is going to be the Mediterranean Sea. And then he says, and the southern border is going to be the river of Egypt. And according to other passages, the river of Egypt is defined as the Red Sea. And then he says, and the eastern border, let's go to the northern border first. The northern border is going to be Mount Hor, which seems to be Mount Hermon, which is up in Lebanon. And then he says, and the western border is going to be the Euphrates River. At one point, he specifically says that the western border is going to be the Jordan River. However, when that's mentioned, it is mentioned in a temporary context to where that's a temporary border, but the real border that God said to the covenant land is to the Euphrates River. Now, if you were to take a map and draw that out, and just take the Mediterranean Sea, that's easy to see, and Mount Hermon is easy to see, and the Jordan and the Euphrates River is easy to see, and the Red Sea is easy to see. So you take on the western side, you take the Mediterranean Sea, then you go up to Mount Hermon, and you put a ruler on Mount Hermon, and starting from the Mediterranean Sea, going through Mount Hermon, and then going straight across to where that line is, and that's going to intersect the Euphrates River, you draw a straight line across the top. Then if you do the same thing at the bottom, you go to the Mediterranean Sea, and then you see where the top of the Red Sea is, and you put your ruler across there and draw a straight line and keep drawing until you intersect the Euphrates River. You are going to find a piece of real estate that has never been owned by the people of Israel. The people of Israel have never, even under Solomon, who expanded the nation bigger than anybody else had ever done, it never reached all the way over to where the bottom line, the southern line that's going through from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea and then continuing on eastward, and going all the way to the Euphrates River. It's never been owned by Israel. That land includes all of the present state of Israel, parts of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and most of Jordan. Wow. And that is going to be significant, because when we get to some of the statements about the prophetic future of the nation of Israel, it is going to be significant that they will eventually own all the oil-rich parts of the world. Because the Bible says that there will be a time when they will own the energy resources of the world. And that is specifically prophesied right here when God sets out, this is the land that you're going to have. Okay, and in chapter 17 that we've already read, he repeats that covenant and says, I'm giving you all of this land, and he asks for the circumcision. Point number B on page 4 says, and God gave 7 points when he reconfirmed this covenant. Number 1, I will confirm the covenant. Number 2, I will greatly increase your numbers. Number 3, I will make you fruitful. Number 4, I will make nations of you. Number 5, I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between you and your descendants and in every generation. Number 6, I will give them an everlasting possession. And number 7, I'm going to be their God. And as we've already mentioned in Galatians 3, verse 16, Paul makes a clear distinction that when he says seed, he's talking about one individual. Even though it's multi-generations, there's one individual in each generation that's going to have that promise. And so the first heir that's going to come after Abraham is going to be Isaac. And Isaac, of course, is not the oldest son in Abraham's family. Abraham, remember the story, was for many, many years without an heir. And so finally there was a kind of a scheme or a plot that was made that he would have a relationship with Sarah's handmaid, and then they would have a baby. And that Sarah would adopt that baby. Well, the thing that happened is that Ishmael was born, but there was never a real full acceptance by Sarah of that child. She said, I'm going to adopt him as my child, but she never really did. And eventually when that Isaac came along, then there was real animosity. And there was animosity between the mother and the baby, and finally, or baby, he wasn't a baby, he was probably about 13 by the time, but finally they were cast out, they were rejected, they were sent out to live in the wilderness. And so Abraham, before that Isaac came along, he actually, in chapter 17 of Genesis, begged God to just make it easy. God, just let this son that I already have be the heir. I don't want to keep believing. I don't want to keep waiting. I don't want to keep, trusting that this is going to happen. It's beyond thinkability at this point. And he begged God, let Ishmael be the one. And God says, no way. No way, Jose. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it my way, not your way. And so then he had to continue believing. So when Isaac did come along, and there was hostility between Ishmael and he had to be kicked out, God reconfirmed that he was going to establish the covenant only through Isaac. Now, the interesting thing in Isaac's life is that God said, Isaac, you have to have a specific relationship with this land. He gets old enough to have a wife, to get married, and Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac. Now, that was the culture in those days, that marriages were arranged by the parents. You didn't go out, to the pizza joint and find a wife. Your wife was brought to you by your parents. Still that way in some cultures around the world. But at any rate, Abraham has the responsibility of finding the proper bride for Isaac. So he sends his servant back to their homeland to try to find a proper girl. The servant says, now Abraham, what about this? What if I get there and I find Mrs. Wright? Miss Wright. You know that marriages really consist of Mr. Right and Miss Right. Exactly? The only thing is you probably don't know their first names. Mr. Wright's first name is never, and Mrs. Wright's first name is always. Okay, but at any rate, so she says, so what if I find Miss Wright? And she says, I ain't leaving. I'm going to stay here. What about if that happens? Abraham says, no way under God's heaven are you going to take my son and take him there to live with her. If she doesn't want to come here to live with him, then the deal is off. Why? Because Abraham knew that God had specifically spoken and said, this covenant land is the land in which that I can establish my covenant and in which that I can fulfill my covenant. You've got to bring her here because Isaac is not going to leave this land. See, it wasn't just you can have the blessing. You got to have the blessing in the land. Okay, and in chapter 26, there's an interesting story that happens, that there is a famine in the land. And Isaac thinks, my goodness, I could go to Egypt, and if I went to Egypt, then I wouldn't starve because of the famine. God specifically spoke to him and said, no, you stay here and you plant your seed in the middle of the famine, in the middle of the drought. And he planted his seed in the middle of the drought, and in the process of that, he got 100-fold return when everybody else was going bankrupt. Because God said there's a covenant promise to the covenant people when they're in the covenant land. You stay here, you plant your seed, even though everybody else is having crop failure, you're going to have an increase. And he did. Okay, so we have Abraham, and then we have Isaac. Isaac was not the first son. The principle of that time was what was called primogeniture, which means the first heir, the first one, the first son becomes the heir to everything. God says, we don't do it the human way. We do it the divine way. The one that I've picked, even though he's the younger son, is going to be the son that's going to receive everything. Just before Abraham died, after Sarah was gone and he had married, taken some concubines and had other sons, he took all of those other sons, and it says he gave them a gift. Now, I have no idea what that gift was. It could have been, $1 Canadian. My guess it was probably more like 10 million Canadian dollars. But he gave every one of them a gift and sent them outside the land. Because he said, there's only one heir that can ever prosper in this land. I'm going to keep Isaac here, and Isaac is going to be the one who's going to receive the covenant, living in the covenant land. Okay? So, we have Abraham, we have Isaac, and then the next person is Jacob. Jacob is an interesting figure because he's the biggest con man in history, as best as I can tell. And he has a brother, Esau. Esau is a few minutes older than him, and so therefore Esau should be the covenant heir. And Isaac is really intending that to happen. He really favors Esau over Jacob. Esau is more of his guy. He's a man's man. He likes to be out in the woods and out in the fields and out hunting, field and stream sort of guy. And Jacob is more of a homebody. He likes hanging around with his mama. And so Isaac has a preference for Esau, and he intends to give the blessing to Esau. So one day, mama finds out, today is the day that Isaac is going to pass the Abrahamic covenant on to Esau. And she says, but we don't want it that way. We want Jacob to get it. And so she comes up with a big scheme. And you all know the story of how that she sends Jacob out to get a goat, and they kill the goat, and they cook the meat, and they take the fur and put it on him, and he goes in, and he deceives his father. And so he takes the covenant away from Esau. That's the second time that he's cheated Esau. The first time Esau had been out hunting, he came home, he was very hungry, and he saw that Jacob was making stew. And he says, hey, give me a bowl of stew. And he says, well, I'll sell you a bowl of stew. And he says, for how much? And he says, well, what about your birthright? What about everything you own? And Esau says, man, I'm so hungry, I think I'm going to die. I'm willing to take that offer. And so he took the physical blessing away from him for one bowl of stew, and then he took the spiritual blessing away from him by cheating him and deceiving him. But even though he was a con man, God had a plan for his life. Isn't that a wonderful message of grace? And we can end there until that we pick up again in the next class. Thank you.